Welcome back to Water Quality Monitoring with South Sound Green and the Nisqually River Education Project. In the last episode, Maya taught you all about water quality and why it's so important for both local wildlife and human populations. Now, we'll talk about the various water quality parameters, or more simply, the water quality values and tests that you may check on your testing day. There are many different aspects of water health. If we want to determine if water is healthy, we need to test as many of these aspects as we can. Healthy can mean different things to different organisms. An easy example is that some fish who live their whole lives in saltwater might find fresh water to be unhealthy, while humans would be unable to survive if we only had access to salt water. For our purposes, we are going to be looking at water quality in terms of whether or not it is healthy for salmon, an important local species that over 100 other organisms rely on. In our water quality monitoring program, we have a lot of different ways to test water quality. Most classes will check the following parameters: dissolved oxygen, temperature, pH, nitrates, and turbidity. These tests can all be done directly on site, or in the classroom shortly after the water sample is collected. Some classes will also test a few more parameters, including biochemical oxygen demand, fecal coliform, and total suspended solids. These additional tests are often done a few days after your testing day or in a laboratory. The tests you conduct will give you a good sense of the overall health of your waterway. Let's start with dissolved oxygen, which, like it sounds, is the amount of oxygen that is dissolved in the water. Most animals that live in the water cannot breathe like animals on land do. Take a deep breath of air. The oxygen you are taking in is traveling to your lungs and throughout your body to keep you healthy. Aquatic animals do the same, though they use gills to extract dissolved oxygen from the water. We usually have plenty of oxygen to breathe on land, but dissolved oxygen levels in water can change a lot depending on environmental conditions. There are a few ways that oxygen can get dissolved in water. One is by water moving fast and creating bubbles. These bubbles trap oxygen and increase dissolved oxygen levels. Places like waterfalls and rapids usually have high dissolved oxygen levels because of this. Still water, like lakes and ponds, may have lower dissolved oxygen levels if they don't have anything to mix and stir them up. Another way oxygen gets dissolved in water is through photosynthesis from aquatic plants. Algae, seaweed, and other aquatic plants photosynthesize just like plants on land, and photosynthesis creates oxygen. However, too much algae in the water may actually not be that great for oxygen. When that algae dies, bacteria in the water come and break it down. In the process, bacteria use dissolved oxygen. So while having a lot of algae may increase oxygen at first, it usually leads to lower oxygen levels overall. We measure dissolved oxygen in milligrams per liter. Next is temperature. I'm sure you've all used the thermometer to measure temperature, or how hot or cold something is. We measure temperature in Celsius instead of Fahrenheit. If you've ever tried to go swimming around Puget Sound, especially in the spring, you might have noticed that the water here gets pretty cold. Fortunately, a lot of animals, including salmon, like the cold. For salmon, who spend their lives traveling between the Puget Sound and the chilly waters of the North Pacific Ocean, colder water is healthier water. One reason that cold water is better for salmon is because cold water can actually hold more dissolved oxygen than warm water. Have you ever opened a can of soda on a hot summer day? only to find that it goes flat pretty fast? This is the same principle. Liquid can hold on to more dissolved gases when it is colder, whether those gases be dissolved oxygen or dissolved carbon dioxide. And we know that salmon need a lot of dissolved oxygen, so it makes sense that they would also like cold water. Let's move on to pH. pH is a bit of an unusual parameter, but basically, pH is a measure for how acidic or basic the water is. If you've ever tasted something sour, you're familiar with acidity. pH is measured on a scale that ranges from 0 to 14, measured in pH units. On this scale, you'll see that acidic substances are lower values, while basic or alkaline substances are higher values. Acids include things that are typically sour, like citrus fruits, and strong acids include stomach acid and battery acid. Bases include eggs and seawater, and bleach is an example of a strong base. In the middle, we have neutral substances, like milk, water, and blood, all substances that humans can interact with comfortably. Salmon prefer to live in water that has a pH value in this neutral range. If water is too acidic or basic, salmon may not be able to survive. Next is nitrates. Nitrates are a form of nitrogen that is a necessary nutrient for many living things. We measure nitrates in milligrams per liter, just like dissolved oxygen. In nature, organic matter, from dead leaves to animal poop, adds nitrates into the soil and therefore into the watershed. But humans can add nitrates to the watershed as well. Plants require nitrates to grow, which is why fertilizer is packed full of nitrates. But what happens when all those extra nitrates get flushed into a local waterway? Just like on land, algae and plants in the water use nitrates to grow. When nitrates from fertilizer, farm animals, and dog poop get carried into the water via their watershed, these nitrates can cause algae to grow like crazy. This is called an algae bloom, and you may have seen one if you've ever been to a lake, pond, or beach and seen the water covered in green algae. At first, you might think this would be good for salmon. Remember that algae makes oxygen? But this isn't always the case. Eventually, bacteria will eat the dying algae and use up a lot of the dissolved oxygen, leaving little available for aquatic animals like salmon. Let's go over this connection again. Adding more nitrogen to the environment can lead to algae blooms, which leads to more bacteria decomposing dead algae and using up dissolved oxygen, which leaves less oxygen for animals like salmon. This process is called eutrophication and can make it very difficult for salmon to survive. Our last big test is turbidity, which is how clear or cloudy the water is. When I hear the word turbidity, it makes me think of turbo or turbulence. This may help you remember what turbidity measures. If there is more turbulence, the water may get more mixed up and stir up sediment and algae, thus increasing the turbidity. Clear water, on the other hand, will have no turbidity. The more turbid the water is, the less light will be able to pass through. Higher turbidity levels can have a lot of impacts on the animals living in the water. Water that is more murky will be difficult to see through, and animals who are not adapted to such environments may find it difficult to hunt prey or avoid predators. Additional particles may also affect breathing through gills, and such particles can smother salmon eggs that are laid in the riverbeds. We measure turbidity using JTUs, which stand for Jackson Turbidity Units. Water with 0 JTUs is perfectly clear, and examples of water with varying JTU levels are shown. Beyond these tests, some classes will also sometimes run the following tests as well. Remember how we talked about bacteria using up oxygen? Biochemical oxygen demand, or BOD for short, is a measure of how much oxygen is being used by bacteria in the water. We measure this by checking the dissolved oxygen of a water sample 5 days after it was collected, and comparing it to the dissolved oxygen of that sample taken at the time of the collection. We subtract the two dissolved oxygen values to see how much dissolved oxygen was used by bacteria in the water and get our BOD value. Fecal coliform is a measure of how much of a specific bacteria is in the water. This fecal coliform bacteria is found in the poop of all warm-blooded animals, from humans to dogs to cows. Fecal coliform in water can be dangerous for humans that eat animals from the water or use the water for recreation. To measure fecal coliform, a water sample has to be analyzed in a lab, where fecal coliform colonies are counted in a petri dish after being incubated. Finally, we have total suspended solids, or TSS for short. This is very similar to turbidity, but instead of measuring how murky the water is, TSS measures the weight of all the particles in the water that is making it murky. Just like turbidity, this can include rocks, bits of organic matter like leaves, and algae. TSS can be calculated in a laboratory, where all of the particles are filtered out of the water sample and then weighed. We measure TSS in milligrams per liter, and lower values are better for salmon. Whew, okay, that was a lot of information. Everybody still with me? Take a few seconds to relax before we talk about optimal values. Okay, back to it. We've talked about all of the water quality tests you may conduct during your water quality monitoring. And when you run these tests, you're going to collect a lot of different numbers. But we still need to give meaning to those numbers. Here, we're going to talk about optimal or ideal values for salmon. These numbers or ranges are the best case scenario for salmon. If we test the water and it comes back with these values, we can conclude that the water may be in pretty good shape. You will be comparing your final results with these optimal values. If your tests come back outside of these optimal value ranges, it may indicate that the water isn't ideal for salmon. Salmon can still live in water that falls outside of these optimal values, but may not be healthy. And for some of our parameters, going too high or too low may be deadly for salmon. Though they may just seem like a bunch of random numbers now, knowing these values will be critical to understanding whether or not your water is healthy for salmon. But don't worry about memorizing all of these. We'll give you these optimal values again in the future. In the next episode, you'll learn from Maya about specific influences on water quality and how you can help to reduce any potential harmful impacts. Thanks for watching.